You too. Hello. Thank you for waiting. Had a little thumb drive scare. All right, so all right, let's see here. So we're doing the early republic. All right, so on this one, in some of my other classes, I switch. You notice that there's it's a little incongruent that at first, on the first four, I do great man history of leaders. And remember, great man history does not mean that you think that they are great people. All it means is that you think in that which caused things to happen the way that they did, that people in great positions of power were largely responsible for the turning of events. And it's kind of an old school way of doing history, because oftentimes, you have history from below, you have social history, you have those who focus upon slaves, focus upon the working class in a certain era, etc. Right? And so we've democratized the historical writing process so that we give it from multiple perspectives, and we understand and appreciate the fact that the common people, the population in a given generation, were complicit. They were a part of what went down, right? And so that's why I only do this once, with a few of the founding fathers, focus upon them. And then sometimes I have it as a separate argumentative piece. I have a couple write-ups on slavery. All right. And you'll notice on this one, I put them two together. All right. So now that there are, instead of four, there are six options. Please be sure to read all six, okay, as all six pertain to the next test. But yeah. All right. So are there any questions before I get going? Diving into number one. Okay. All right. Well, the thing is when our Constitution was being written, certainly when it was being ratified, right, given approval, during that process, it sort of just materialized that there were two large factions that really came out. Remember, a faction oftentimes is identified as a group that shares the same self-interest. So like, cash crop farmers, industrial factory owners, they would be, two different factions with their own self-interest. But in this case, we're talking about factions in the sense that are factions based upon belief, okay, and their philosophy. Now, I throw in my 2 cents on this subject, and you could do with it as you may, but it's something that I feel as an observation ought to be at least entertained, all right, by your brains. And that is, when I look at Mexican history, when I look at European history, and I see those who wanted to conserve the status quo or even be regressive and go back to an alleged good old days, right? Those who sat in the Third Estate, the Third Estates General, during the French Revolution, sat on the right wing of the Estates General chamber. And those who were for the new ideas of the Enlightenment, the Scottish and French Enlightenment, as you recall, who wanted some fundamental changes to government, to man, to society, they sat on the left wing of the chamber. And so that's where we get the term right wing and left wing. All right. Just generically, at least in the beginning, that's all it meant, is those who wanted novel change and those who wanted to maintain old historical traditions, etc. Well, when I look at other countries, I see a bona fide gap between the left and the right. In Mexico, you had Agustin de Iturbide, you had Anastasio Bustamante, and others who were okay with having an emperor or king over Mexico. They were okay with having a landed aristocracy. And remember that aristoi means the best in Greek. So an elite group who alone had opportunities for political positions and economic opportunities that were not given to the rest of the population. Okay. They wanted to keep church and state wedded together and have a Catholic Mexico, okay, officially. They wanted a very strong standing army. And they didn't care much about having anything like a Bill of Rights, freedom of the press, um, political parties, etc. The democratic or at least even representative government, some of them were against it on the right down in Mexico. Then you look at their left, and my goodness, right? The two priests, Father Hidalgo and Father Morelos after him. Morelos met at a place called Chilpancingo, and they started, putting some of the ideas together into this mission statement for a new Constitution of Mexico. And they wanted political equality for all men. So they had Black men in Mexico, slaves and ex-slaves. They wanted to end slavery, and they wanted complete political equality for all men of all colors. They wanted also to locally have the people who tend the land themselves democratically make decisions about where the wealth, right, where the fruits of their labor goes, how it's allocated. That's almost like Marxist syndicalism, as it's called. And that's like a democratic form of communism. All right. And so when I look there, I see a gap. I see a huge gap. And so to me, right, when the person on the right or the person on the left gain control of Mexico, it doesn't surprise me that much that the other side saw such ruin, right? Because the winning side, their vision for the country was so diametrically different from theirs, so far and distant from theirs, that they couldn't imagine just tolerating such a society. With ours, right? I don't see that. I really don't. There was Thomas Jefferson, right, on behalf of the guys on our left. And he wrote in correspondence to a French friend, and he was able to write and muse upon lots of topics, tons of topics. All right. And those letters of correspondence were put together by James Madison and some friends, and they were melded together into a book, and it was called Notes on the State of Virginia. So a lot of that which we take to be Jefferson's belief system, his rhetoric, what he claimed to stand for, comes from that book alone, Notes on the State of Virginia. Okay. And he also made a name for himself as an assemblyman and then governor of Virginia, to be in favor of democratic changes, enlightenment, checks and balances. He wrote strongly against slavery. He talked about giving land to the poor whites of Virginia so that all of them could technically meet the requirements for being a citizen and being able to vote. And so, you have reason to believe that he was over in the left. Okay. Nevertheless, he chose to go to France when the Constitution was written. He limited his opposition to that document, and he agreed to follow it once he came back and it had been ratified. All right. So remember, that Constitution, as we went over, is not that radical, is it? It's a strong central government, a strong central Congress. Only the House reps were directly elected by citizens, and each state gets to decide upon citizenship. a president by electoral college rather than direct vote, Supreme Court of handpicked men, presidential cabinet like England had done with the king, of handpicked men. And so he was okay with that conservative of a republic, right, that we came up with, and that gave the okay to slavery and had a fugitive slave clause in it, right? So at any rate, going over to the right, Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, they wanted the president, Hamilton did, he wanted the president to serve for life. Okay. He made arguments that the House reps being the only ones directly elected was enough, because he said the reps, he hoped, would be good stewards, like good babysitters, that they would be wiser than the people who voted them in and more capable of making sound political decisions than the regular masses of people. To them, right, to him, I liken it to like a mechanic, right? That you might believe that there ought to be equal protections under the law and criminal law to all people, equal opportunities in the capitalist economy for all people. But you don't believe certainly that everybody's equally capable of writing an English paper for you, or of fixing your car, right? Or building your house. And so just as some people are more skilled, have had more time, have had more training, etc., for this trade or that, he said it goes the same with politicians. That he said, hopefully, the common people will choose the better sort, those who are more intelligent, better educated, and can make wiser, sounder decisions than their constituents would. So he was snobby, okay, and he had an aristocratic side. But he and John Adams were fine with the clause that said there'll be no titles of nobility given in this country. After all, Hamilton went from rags to riches, right? And so he was for theoretically everyone else having the same chance to do what he had done. They both were against slavery, and they were on the right. They too, like Jefferson, voiced a hostile opposition to slavery, okay, as against the laws of nature, they said, and the laws of God. So my point being, and they too, right, were fine with the Republic. I mean, after all, they were largely responsible for writing the Constitution, the conservatives were, and establishing the Republic that we have. And the Republic is like Rome, right? The Romans had elected tribunes, but then they had handpicked aristocratic senators over them with checks and balances. And then they had the Senate got to elect the two consuls or presidents. And so Rome was not very democratic, but neither was it too aristocratic either. And so the conservatives were also fine with this same government. So to me, I personally don't think that our gap between our left and right was nearly as broad as the gap in Mexico and Latin America and some of these other countries. Okay. I don't think our liberals were that liberal, and I don't think our conservatives were that conservative. But what happens though, right, is what I contend in number one is that image is super important. No matter how conservative you really are or aren't, right? If you convey the image of being excessively conservative, it's going to elicit protest. It's going to elicit the organization of opposition to you. And that's exactly what happened. Is I personally don't think Hamilton was that uber conservative, but what he did here in number one made him look as if he were. And that was enough. Image sometimes can be reality. And so this is going, Hamilton almost alone is going to provoke right, the formation of an oppositional second party, right, known as the Democratic Republicans, which would later become known as the Democrats. All right. So what did he do? Well, he comes in, right, and he says, first of all, we're going to pay all the state's debts, the national government, that is, right? He says we have to have credibility with other countries and other foreign banks in the future. We have to be responsible and pay those debts back. So in doing so, right, he, on behalf of the U.S. government, he took loans, and that was constitutional, right? And he also decided to raise money through a bond system. And with bonds, right, you lend money to the government, and the government pays you back plus interest to make it worthwhile for you to lend to it. Well, who has the means to do that? The well-to-do, the wealthy, right? So here he is going on bond campaigns, and he's going to Wall Street. He's going to the business districts of the major cities in the Northeast and getting them, the wealthy business classes and merchant classes, to purchase bond certificates, right? And by the way, he said that the government ought to take its sweet time in paying their wealthy back, because while the wealthy are waiting for their money back from the government, they have a selfish reason to see that the government is maintained. So they'll become allies to the government, even if out of a selfish reason, wanting their money back. So that was the kind of cynicism that Hamilton used, okay, as a businessman. But then he said, we have to become a self-sufficient country economically, right? And the idea to him is they use this 100 years later, with the railroads. Is they said, okay, if you're a businessman and you're sitting on capital to play with, you're going to find the easiest, the quickest route to make more money out of your money. Why would you want to go investing and pay an overhead, right, to purchase land, equipment, pay your laborers? Why would you want to do something with deferred gratification so that you're paying out money a long time before a single cent comes in? And that's what happened with the railroads, right? And so he said, the answer is the government must make it worth your while. The government must incentivize businessmen to engage in different types of production and services that help the entire country out. So one thing that he said, like railroads, was infrastructure, right? Transportation and communication. He said we have to tie different cities together, different regions together, by either canals or the somewhat paved roads that they had at that time, known as turnpikes, like little early freeways. So at any rate, he paid people to do such. He subsidized them on behalf of federal funds. Okay. Then he said, you know what? One of the early industries that's really taking off are textiles, the making of clothing, right? And we were largely buying our textiles from Flanders, which is modern day Belgium, or England. And he says that needs to stop. We need to develop our own textiles. So again, he subsidized the textile industry. Okay. So as he's doing this, he's desperate for money. All this costs money. So he decides to have, he pushes Congress to pass the first import tariffs. Okay. And the import tariffs are like, you have a competitor who could pull a Walmart on you, right? By economies of scale, just by the scale alone of how much of that product he could produce, he could end up selling it for a super low price and undersell you. And it'll still add up because he's selling so many of them. And he's so wealthy that he could weather the initial storm and run you out of business. So now we put an artificial tax on imported goods that are brought here to the coast from Europe. So then it artificially makes the price of those European products go higher, so that Americans will be more likely to buy the lower priced American products instead. Now, that in and of itself sounds almost neutral as far as, different demographics. But the problem is as they voted on an import tariff for one product after another, he was listening to the lobbyist power of the wealthiest industries, right? The wealthiest industries already were lobbying in Congress. And sometimes, remember, that's almost involves bribery to get them to put whether so it's textiles, let's say, then they get Congress to pass a import tariff on imported textiles. But what about in the South and so forth? What about tobacco? What about cotton? Right? Rice, indigo. They didn't have the lobbyist power. And so they had no such import tariff put to protect their stuff. So it was like he played favorites with the big guns, with the import tax. Then he declared a domestic tax. He called it an excise or a sin tax. And that comes back to the Puritans. Stuff that is not necessary and even might be determined to be sinful. So anything that alters your state of being. So alcoholic beverages, caffeinated beverages, which ironically included tea. But remember, you guys, he was handpicked by a president who was elected by the electoral college system, not even directly elected himself. And he's raising taxes. Remember, it says in the Constitution that all taxes must originate with the House of Representatives. And he broke that. So now people are getting taxed without their elected officials' permission. The same thing that Britain was doing to us. And then there was a rebellion amongst the whiskey distillers. Okay, because what they were doing is it was already known at this time that those who could not catch up and stay up with the big wheat farmers who could undersell you, it was a shortcut for them, for the poorer, less fortunate cash crop farmers, to distill that wheat into whiskey and sell it as whiskey. So this was their pursuit, you guys, of the American dream. And now it's being hurt by the whiskey tax. So they rebelled. Well, he got permission from President Washington to build an army of 13,000 soldiers. And this was, you guys, more than we usually had at the Continental Army fighting against the British. And they went and marched on the whiskey rebels. And by the time they got there, the whiskey rebels had thrown down their guns. But still, the newspapers stated it, right? That the current administration had put together a larger army than it had against the British to kill its own people. All right. And then, by the way, he's doing a lot of this by way of a national bank. And if you look, neither Congress, nor in Article 1, nor the executive, where he was under, in Article 2, was given the power to form a national bank. See, England had a national bank. So to a lot of people, that was a form that was proof that national banks are oligopolies. They're plutocracies. Plutocracy is ruled by the rich. So not only was this bank, already controversial, already resented, but then when the opposition took them to court saying it wasn't constitutional, their attorneys used that controversial clause at the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, that the federal government can do what is necessary and proper to carry out any of the other powers that it was given. So it's given a power to raise and collect taxes. It's given the power to pay the state's debts, right? And so they contended that it was necessary and proper to have a bank to do those two things. But remember, that was already seen as a blank check that the liberals hated, that necessary and proper clause, for this very reason, that the conservatives would begin doing some very unpopular things and increase the federal government's own power at the people's expense and justifying it with that clause. So at any rate, James Madison, who had written most of the Constitution, so clearly, right, he was in the camp of the conservatives at one point. James Madison switched sides at this point, said that he had become disillusioned with Hamilton, but also, he said, disillusioned with President Washington, because Washington played the act that he was neither left nor right, that he was like a paternal father figure to the country, and he did not want to see left and right fighting as if they were two of his kids fighting each other. But the fact that Washington let Hamilton do all this, it confirmed to a lot of liberals that Washington also was secretly an uber conservative. So you had a guy named Philip Freneau and other newspaper journalists who wrote scathingly of what the first administration was up to. And of course, it engaged in hyperbole, right? Hyperbole is strategic, deliberate exaggeration. So he states, right, Freneau and some of these writers, they start calling George Washington King George. And they're saying King George is letting his aristocratic, Secretary of the Treasury run amok, and he will do nothing to discipline him. Others say that the spirit of 76 was being lost or broken. And 1776, right, they wrote the Declaration of Independence with a social contract, the natural rights of man, all that enlightened stuff, right? They said that spirit was being broken now and betrayed by this first administration. So James Madison, leaving the administration, joins up with Thomas Jefferson and writers like Philip Freneau and they began organizing these debates in some of the biggest newspapers. But more than that, they began politically uniting and forming the beginning of what will become a second party. And this is the origin of our two-party system. Okay. So then number two, David McCullough, and as you see on his title, in his biography of John Adams, he is sympathetic to him. Okay, this is a sympathetic thesis to John Adams. The French Revolution happens at this time. It gets really at the height of its kind of radical phase when the Jacobins took over from the Gironde. And remember, the Jacobins were declaring the aristocracy enemies of the state, and they were confiscating their land and even beginning to have them beheaded with the infamous guillotine, just simply by their economic affiliation, not having committed a single crime against the government, but being born and a part of the old aristocracy. They went after the church, the Catholic Church. They even beheaded some opposing Catholic priests and bishops. They even tried to declare a new year, a year one, after this worldwide enlightenment, because they said nothing had been like this revolution before. So they declared year one of reason, because they also did not want it on the Gregorian calendar based upon Jesus. So this was pretty radical. Well, Thomas Jefferson, especially, had some quotes whereby he sounded to the public a little bit cavalier, right? Like a little bit like blasé, a little bit just like, oh, it's no big deal, over something that was indeed a very big deal, regarding the violence of the Jacobin rule. And he said basically it was a means to an end, that there needs to be a new cleansing, and the old must come out and the new must come in, and future generations will benefit from it. It just necessarily has to get a little bloody now. He'd even gone over and helped write the Declaration of the Rights of Man amongst the French revolutionary leaders. Thomas Jefferson did. Yeah. And so to the conservatives, right, that made them gasp.
That's great.
That, yes. Yeah, that made them gasp. They were, it confirmed to them that Jefferson was as radical as his notes on the state of Virginia seem to imply. All right. To conservatives like John Adams wanted, again, I don't think he was that far to the right. John Adams wanted a Republican mixed form of representative government. Okay. He was not an aristocrat. He wanted no aristocracy. He wanted no king. He wanted no official church. He wanted separation of church and state as well. But he wanted change by law, right? By law, not by some violent upheaval. So he hated the manner by which the French Revolution was being fought. And then secondly, John Adams was one of our most vocal Christian presidents that we've had. And when they began killing Catholic clergy, he declared that this whole movement of the French Revolution had become nothing short of like satanic, of the devil. All right. So at any rate, John Adams narrowly defeats Thomas Jefferson to become the second president. All right, after 2 terms, first by Washington. And all this drama is going on, right? And in the meantime, also, there have developed pretty substantial enclaves. Remember, enclaves like a Chinatown, an ethnically homogenous part of a city? Mm-hmm. There had developed some sizable enclaves of French immigrants, especially in Louisiana. Came into the port of New Orleans and other parts throughout the mainly the South. And not only that, many of them began forming Jacobin organizations. And remember, to the conservatives, Jacobin was a bad word because they were the ones killing the priests, killing the landed aristocracy back in France, beheaded the king, Louis XVI. And so at any rate, this was alarming to him. And then, like I said, people like Philip Freneau were saying that if we had any consistency with our revolution, that we would and should support the French Revolution. Because as you know, it devolves into a bit of chaos after the leaders of the Jacobin government, Danton and Robespierre, are beheaded themselves, right? The French Revolution kind of devoured its own. At that point, right, you get the rise of Napoleon. And that's a bit of an oxymoron, a bit, is he is going to make himself unilaterally an emperor over the French Empire, he calls it, instead of just the French nation. But he institutes his Napoleonic Code. And that Napoleonic Code, when you look at it, was pretty enlightened. For instance, against the patriarchy, the powers that men had over women, to be able to beat them, to be able to alone divorce them, to be able to get custody of the kids, that all of that at one time was in the man's favor. And Napoleonic Code was greatly liberating for women. Right. And it had other enlightened components to it as well. So what he contended, right, is that they had been attacked, you guys. They had been invaded by conservative forces twice during the French Revolution. As you may remember, one time, there was an attempt to steal Louis XVI when he was a prisoner and rescue him. And I can't remember the other instance, but they began interfering in this French Revolution. It was mainly Austria, and Germany was 39 separate states still at this time, and it will be for like another 100 years or 70 years. But the main state of Germany was Prussia, and Prussia had a fine army, and the Prussians going to get involved with the Austrians as well as the English against the French. So Napoleon basically says, it's us against the world. We're not only going to fight back, but we're going to grab a hold of new territory itself. We're going to expand French territory into an empire, and we're going to impose the Napoleonic Code over them. So hence we will enlighten them. So hence Napoleon claimed that he was spreading the French Revolution to continental Europe. So as this drama is ensuing, John Adams immediately goes to Congress, and most of Congress were Federalists, were conservatives like himself still at this time, elected into office, right? Those on the right, not the left. And so he was definitely part of some of the laws that they passed that were very controversial, no doubt. Even though Congress made the laws, he passed them. He met with them. He was complicit in the process. All right, and we're going to get to them real soon. But first, he gets them to grant him the construction of a navy. Okay. And he has that navy go into the Caribbean, because remember, Martinique, Guadeloupe, San Domingue, and some of these other islands in the Caribbean were held by the French. So the French, through trade and other things, were going in and out of the Caribbean quite often. But what they were doing, and really both sides were doing it, is they were violating what was becoming known as international rights of neutral nations. To be able to trade, for instance, with either or both belligerents, both sides of a war, nations at war, as long as it's not against the list. And against the list in Latin goes into the word contraband. So as long as it's not contraband, the Americans should have been free to do that. And the French were violating that. But in all honesty, as the liberals contended, the British were as well. But John Adams didn't like the French. He didn't like this revolution. So he brought the Navy down to protect American vessels there from the French, shooting them out of the water, stopping and confiscating their goods, asking them if they're bringing anything to their English or Prussian enemies, and then taking it. And so in doing that, right, it caused what was called the quasi-war, right? Quasi, almost, sort of, but not official. So he was part of this quasi-war. He was behind it with Napoleonic France. Okay. With French Revolutionary France. And so at any rate, in addition to that, they issued the Alien and Sedition Acts, as you see here. The Alien Act, Congress was given it in Article 1, Section 8. Congress has control of immigration and deportation. And what do they do in this act? They hand it over, supposedly, momentarily, temporarily, they hand that power over to the president and say he has the power to deport radical French immigrants who are stirring up trouble here in the States. So all of this, you guys, is angering the liberals. Okay? The Democratic Republicans. Then the Sedition Acts. They were a little bit broader, more nebulous in a bad way, is that they contended, right? The latter curtailed Americans' First Amendment rights as any expression that knowingly misrepresented American foreign policy, that provoked rebellion, and that cited the hatred of the good people of the United States for the federal government was punishable by fine or even incarceration. So this was definitely a curtailment, a cutting short of Americans' First Amendment rights. And you would imagine, right, Jefferson and others on the left said, of course, a conservative administration is curtailing our First Amendment right. That would be just like them. Okay. However, there was an expectation by the diehards of John Adams' party to fully implement these laws and take advantage of them by not only shutting up and getting rid of French, uh, incendiary troublemakers, but also get rid of political opponents. So he supposedly, according to this book, very, very weakly enforced both laws. They expected right away, right, with the Espionage Act, go after Philip Freneau and that darn newspaper of his that keeps just crucifying the conservatives, right? And he refused to have him arrested. And said, okay, get rid of the French radicals and the enclaves. He didn't. Now, why is that? Because supposedly he became conscience stricken about those laws, about the type of precedent that it could begin for later generations of American leaders. Okay. And so then he even switched his ambassador to Napoleonic France, who was no longer a war hawk, but someone who wanted peace. I can't remember the guy's name, but he switched to a dove as his ambassador because he did not want to get involved in an actual war with revolutionary France. And that greatly disappointed his own party. Then Napoleon is humiliated by the Haitian Revolution of black slaves, right? And John Adams gives a speech to Congress and moves that they recognize the new Haitian Republic. And you guys got to realize how radical of a gesture that was. This was known, you guys, as the first modern Black Republic in world history. And they had come about by a slave insurrection that was known to have either killed or knocked off the island virtually all white French men. But why is that? Is remember, he was a firm believer with his Christianity and with his beliefs of the Enlightenment, that all human beings are just that, are human beings. And these were enslaved human beings who fought for and earned their freedom, and he was impressed. Well, the conservatives were not. And then also there was Fry's Rebellion. And this was a rebellion that both sides put a lot of symbolic meaning behind. And remember, John Adams had remembered the Whiskey Rebellion and how badly that looked, right? When our own government turned such a massive army against its own people. Well, this rebellion was more of a riot, and some authorities had been killed. But John Adams, who had been a lawyer for years, researched what happened, and he pardoned Mr. Fries and said that he was not personally responsible for those people in the crowd killing the authoritative figures. And the conservatives were furious. But he said, I don't want an innocent man to be executed. So going back to the thesis, McCullough puts it down to the fact that he said John Adams was a brutally honest, well-principled man. He believed as a Christian that he was going to have to stand before God as how he had ruled as president. And he was into impressing God more than he was into impressing any person or political party. So McCullough turns this into a romantic thing, right? And says that John Adams was just too good of a man. He was too honest and walked his own path. And therefore he alienated himself from both sides. And he wasn't, quote, political enough to play the game that people would want him to play. And that's just pick a party and adhere to all of its policies, whether you personally agree with all of them or not. And he said that integrity, he basically was punished for that integrity because he alienated both sides and therefore lost the needed support to win re-election. So John Adams is our first one-term president. Okay, as our second president. And I got to add something that's not as romantic. Is John Adams also was admitted by almost everybody that was close to him that he was a bit cantankerous. He was a bit grouchy. People easily got on his nerves. And so he wasn't always too great of a people person. And he was in the same political party as the mighty, powerful Alexander Hamilton, right? And Hamilton was not a foe you wanted to make. You did not want to make an enemy out of Hamilton, especially if you were already in his camp as a conservative. And John Adams simply did not like Alexander Hamilton. He called him a vain peacock. He said everything Hamilton did was for looks, for appearance, that he was an egotistical man out for his own image and his own popularity. And so he made an enemy out of Hamilton when he didn't have to. All right. So at any rate, number 3, I could have put this together more articulately. I did it very quickly. This is a paraphrase, okay? And I'm acting as if I'm Thomas Jefferson, which of course, you know, is just a little ploy. But by all means, if you guys have the chance to look at Richard Hofstadter's book, American Political Tradition, it is worthwhile. It is such a good book. He has a different chapter on a different American leader. And he gets into a psychological thesis about what made him or her tick, so to speak.
Who's
every chapter.
Who's the author of that?
Richard Hofstadter. Right here.
Oh, it's in the title. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Richard Hofstadter, and it's called American Political Tradition. It's a great book. I think you'd like it.
Okay.
But at any rate, right, you get a picture of a very vulnerable, insecure, and passive-aggressive Thomas Jefferson. All right. His mom was Jane Randolph. The Randolphs were really somebody in Great Britain. They were high-ranking nobles. Okay. And because of that, he was able to go to the University of William and Mary. He was able to go to France. He had tutors from the time he was very young. He was taught 3-4 languages. He had the finest education. Okay. And read all the classics. That was on account of his mom's name, her title, and her money. Okay. He wanted to go out and do work on the plantation. And his father would say, no, 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 son, you take advantage of your mother's blood. You go and you go much higher than I've ever gone. And go and prepare yourself for a bright future. But he never felt secure in his dad telling him that, because he always felt like his dad would see him as just such, as his privileged little Randolph son. At any rate, the dad, Peter Jefferson, was not of noble status. So the mom married down. And the dad received the title to her wealth, to her property, etc., by marrying her, right? Under, it was called coverture, the laws of coverture. And he agreed to allow her parents to stay with them and to still continue their privileged lifestyle, and that, you know, he didn't want to take from them. It was seen to be a conciliatory act to make peace with the in-laws. But according to this chapter, they were almost mercilessly cruel to their son-in-law, to Thomas Jefferson's dad, his maternal grandparents. And his mom did nothing about it, as they constantly reminded his dad that he was nothing, he was nobody, and that their daughter could have and should have married a much greater man. All right. So in his correspondences, and also get this, is he's reading this Enlightenment work, right? In his musings, in his education, and it's talking about how everything is wrong with the old world because it was based upon privilege and aristocracies, right? And unfairness, a lack of equality of opportunity, and all that. That had to have, according to Hofstadter, been extremely convicting to him, who was getting that education because of his mom's connections and money, right? So he develops an anger toward his grandparents and his mother. And he writes this, we have it in written form, that he wanted never to be a son of privilege and flaunt his family name around like his mother's family did. Right? And then he said he wanted a government more democratic than the British system, because he said he believed in the virtue and the sagacity of the common man. The virtue is self-explanatory, and sagacity is like worldly wisdom, right? That you may not have gone to school, but you're wise about things. You could see through people. You know what a wise policy would or wouldn't be,
Like
etc.
a strong intuition of the future.
Yes, absolutely. So I define that, or he defined it as sagacity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He said he valued the virtue and the sagacity of the common people. And he even states, like my father. So Jefferson, according to Hofstadter, Jefferson was engaging in a bit of catharsis and getting his anger out toward his mother's family, but also engaging in compensation because of his wealth guilt, and secretly trying to win the approval deep down of his dad, of his commoner dad, and try to convince his dad, see, Dad, I'm your son just as I am my mother's son. I'm not just your privileged child. And so you have him in the White House. And there was an orphan lady who lived near the White House because they had just moved it down to the Potomac in Maryland and Virginia, right? And at any rate, if someone came in from another country, etc., and was putting on a lot of airs as being better than, he would do things in such a way, ignore them, etc., to cut them down to size, because he hated that type of what's the word, when you that presumptuousness, right? And he would spend more of his time speaking with the elderly woman who was his neighbor at the table, who he always invited to dinners, no matter how high ranking of a person was also invited. So he would give the well-to-do and the proud the silent treatment, and he would really open his arms out to the poor that were all around him, etc., to the point of coming by their homes, pretending to ask them questions of just this or that nature, and sneaking in money or food into their house and then leaving discreetly. So he would do all this, right? And according to Richard Hofstadter, he felt this sense as if subconsciously Thomas Jefferson is thinking, I hope my dad is proud of me, as he's trying to compensate for this wealth guilt. I just found it so fascinating. You read the book, you read the chapter on him, and you kind of just want to give him a hug. He just seems like he was carrying so much with him all through his adulthood, from his childhood. But he becomes our third president. He easily defeats John Adams when he tries a second time in 1800. And so his opponents say, don't vote for Jefferson. Heads are going to roll into the Potomac. That, like the Jacobins of the French Revolution, he's going to start beheading the wealthy Americans. He's a radical French revolutionist. And as you may know, he certainly did not do that. In fact, it's largely known to have been the antithesis, the opposite of that. Is a lot of what he did as president was conservative. So historians are like, what the heck happened? Right? For instance, some people think that, he wrote the notes on the state of Virginia when he was in his 30s. And now he's like in his 60s. That time and the acquisition of power perhaps changed him and made him more conservative. Others contend that he was just a hypocrite, inconsistent. And another thesis out there is, I take that back, okay? He did not easily beat John Adams. It went to, no one had an electoral majority, but he had an electoral plurality. He had the most electoral points, but you have to have a majority of them, right? So when you don't, the two top people are brought to the House of Reps, according to the Constitution, and the House of Reps decides on who that president will be. Well, he was in there for quite some time, and the press was nowhere near. All right. And they said when he left, he was very sedate, very sober. And people asked him if he thought perhaps that he had lost. And he said, no, not necessarily. Some people think that he made a deal with the conservatives in the House for them to choose him as president. That perhaps they came to him and said, hey, we've read your works. we've heard from this source and that source that you might be a possibly very radical person in, in there. So what do you say about, how can you promise us that you won't be? So some people think he made a deal with the conservatives in the House of Reps not to be a radical president. And by the way, I was wrong again. John Adams, he did easily beat. It was Aaron Burr that tied with him. Aaron Burr was supposed to step down, and he didn't because they're from the same party. And they got the same amount of electoral points. And that's when the whole drama with Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr leading to the famous duel. That's how that happened. Is Hamilton was in Congress, and he said basically, Thomas Jefferson is the devil we know. Aaron Burr is the devil that we don't know. And it'd be better to have the devil we know. He says there's are indications that are indicting of Aaron Burr's character. And so God only knows what he'll do if he's president. So let's choose the lesser evil and choose Thomas Jefferson.
I'm
So
sorry.
at any rate,
Aaron Burr was the runner-up against who?
against Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, they actually tied. Yeah, they tied in electoral points.
Okay.
And the House of Reps chose Jefferson.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. All right. And so at any rate, he comes in, right? And he wants to do a crusade against ignorance and have a public school system for the whole country. And the opposition rose quite strongly and said, hey, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you could do that. And in fact, the 10th Amendment says whatever is not explicitly given or suggested to the federal government is reserved to the states. And so by that interpretation, education, because it's not mentioned, is to be a state issue and not a federal issue. So at any rate, that went kaput. Then he puts in a Secretary of Treasury who was known to be pretty radical, Gallatin, Albert Gallatin. And Gallatin does his homework, and he comes back and says, Mr. President, there are so many government loans out to different businesses and different industries. The government owes so many people money through bond certificates, etc. He said it would be absolutely disastrous for us to kill the national bank right now. That it's intertwined in too many things. It's not feasible. So we need to leave Hamilton's bank alone and Hamilton's system. Because remember, Thomas Jefferson thought he couldn't begin to tell you on how many counts in his earlier life how wrong Hamilton's financial system was in his estimation. But instead, he leaves it be. Okay. Then he says that he wants to become a he wants to end the French threat in the Louisiana Territory. I don't know if I have the picture. I should, but I may not. I used to, dang it. But no, I don't. The Louisiana Territory, you guys, was incredible. I don't know if I'm able to do this. Let me see if I'm able to share the screen. But the French and the Spanish had done many things to us in closing down the see here, closing down the Mississippi River to us and trade. So you see this right here? You see it there, you see it here. That's the Louisiana swath of land. Look at this one right here. It virtually doubled the size of our country, purchasing the Louisiana territory. And so the French, Napoleon had it. And what Thomas Jefferson contended, and there was some truth to this, is he stated that Napoleon was mercurial. And mercurial is like bipolar. It's you're fit to sudden drastic changes of mood and make some very just sudden erratic changes in your policies, etc. So he said, it is scary to have a neighbor holding on to that much land whose land is contiguous or touching our borders. So he sent a few men without getting permission from Congress to try to purchase that land from Napoleon. And that's indeed what they did. All right. And so
Would that be illegal today?
I'm sorry?
Would that be illegal today?
No, I mean, now it wouldn't, because, you know, the Secretary of State purchased Alaska in 1867. So we've done it since. Yeah, Seward's Folly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, we've done it after this. Of course, we
Okay.
purchased in 1895 or so the Hawaiian Islands. And so we've definitely have done it since.
Mhm.
We in 1848, we're going to grab most of that green on the left in the Mexican-American War. Right? We're gonna steal it from Mexico with the it's actually this one right here, that yellow land right there. All of this yellow right here.
Oh.
We'll take that in 1848 from Mexico. And so yeah, so they were willing to do it. And so his men took advantage of it. They purchased the land, and then he came back and asked Congress subsequently, after the fact, to approve it. Because technically, right, you might want to, it's kind of semantics, right? Playing with words. As you could say, well, technically, the president has power to make treaties. And technically, this is a treaty. But it says, right, with the permission of the Senate, anytime you make a treaty. And so the Senate had nothing to do with it until after. But he wanted to rubber stamp it after to give it some semblance of legality. He asked the Senate to approve it after the fact. And they did. But yeah. And so he purchases all that land, right? And then people say, okay, great. Remember, in his writings, he had talked about the old Greek thing of hundreds, of having villages of 100 inhabitants and having them be semi-independent, autonomous, and have them everything by popular vote and make decisions on the local resources. And the people who work the land get to have a say in the land, like I mentioned, a little bit like Marxist syndicalism, the most democratic form of communism. And so at any rate, he wrote about that, right? So why doesn't he dabble with that? But instead, right, there was a guy named Wilkerson, along with Aaron Burr, that same Aaron Burr, who were making deals, private deals, to sell this land off to Spain. And secretly, and get rich from doing it. And to cede it from the United States. Not only that, it was filled with French Cajuns at the bottom. And remember, the Cajuns were from Arcadia, Canada, and they have been forcefully moved into Louisiana after 2 or 3 big violent uprisings. So they had a reputation for being rebellious, the Cajuns. Okay. And then you had the Creoles. And the Creoles came from 1713 when the French established New Orleans. And they were before the French Revolution. So they were all about the Ancien regime, the old school way of doing things. They wanted an aristocracy. They didn't want the commoners to have any opportunities or any political power. They were totally on the other end of being just uber conservative. In fact, I wouldn't even say conservative. I would say regressive, of wanting to go backward in time, right? To prior to the French Revolution. And then, of course, you had Native Americans, right? And you also had already at this time the runners of the forest, the Coureurs de Bois or whatever, the French fur trappers. And they had a reputation for being out for themselves and enriching themselves and so forth, right? So when he looks at that territory, he says, you know what? It's not ready for self-government. Because technically, right, every state is entitled to a republican form of government, but not every territory. So right now in this phase, it's merely a territory. It hasn't been, they haven't been allowed into as new states yet. So he says they don't get to have their constitutional rights yet and have a right to a republican form of government because they're still merely a territory. And he said, I don't trust any of the main demographics that live there. I sure as heck don't trust the Cajuns. The Creoles are way too conservative and won't want to share power with anybody. The Native Americans, that's a whole other bottle to open another time. And then the French fur trappers, no, I don't think so. So instead of establishing democratic government like he had written about in the past, he put a very undemocratic government there. He put in military over there, and he handpicked 21 men in the north and 21 men in the south to be the rulers for the time being, handpicked rulers over that vast region. So, you know what I mean? He's not doing anything that he had once written about. He had written in the past, if a president doesn't have if it's not explicitly stated of what the president can do, then he can't do it. He had made that clear. Well, it wasn't explicitly clear that the president could purchase territory, and he did it anyway. And he was aware of the hypocrisy, and he basically said, well, future generations will pardon me, he said, because the country is going to, benefit from this so well eventually that it's best that sometimes you have to have immoral means to high ends, right? So at any rate, he does that. Then he wants to become he wants to balance the budget. All right. And he tries to cut the bureaucracy down that John Adams had created. And for one reason, right, is he said, if we can get economically sound and no longer in debt, then we can eventually get rid of Hamilton's system, right? But he made the argument that so many of our men are trading in the Mediterranean, and they are running afoul of piracy. So you just see ships here, but I wanted it to show the map. Okay, so there you have it. So that's North Africa, right? And you see Tripoli. I think that's like modern day Libya. So you have Morocco and Algeria and Libya, over here Egypt. And at any rate, they had an empire coming from Damascus in the Near East, and they would put a pasha, right? A pasha, like a governor over certain regions. The Sultan would, right, of this big caliphate, this Muslim caliphate. And the Basha of Tripoli was murdered by a younger brother. And the other brother, the family, I have the name down in there. It's like Karamanli or something like that. And the younger brother's name was Yusuf. And Yusuf killed his older brother for the throne. Then Yusuf was like the middle child, and the younger one was scared to death of Yusuf, especially after that act, and asked for his life and said he'd happily be exiled. And so he was exiled to Egypt. So Yusuf, taking control, begins to make a lot of money off of piracy and human trafficking. They almost indiscriminately capture ships on the Mediterranean, come aboard, take the belongings, right? And take any wealth and products and jewelry, etc., that they can take. And then if there's anything they believe of note of the people in there, like maybe someone important, maybe someone wealthy, etc., or someone that might be a good, sturdy worker, they would capture them and bring them back to Tripoli. Well, they would have to put all of the booty handed over to Pasha Yusuf. He would take his lion's share and he would give them commission for doing their work, right? And he would take the prisoners and he would have them sent most of the time to Istanbul. Istanbul, there was still a very live market of human trafficking there in Turkey. And it was a big money-making enterprise. So at any rate, Thomas Jefferson becomes convinced that too many of his merchants and his cash crop farmers are being robbed or abducted or murdered by, it's getting a lot of press, by these Barbary Coast pirates, right? And also, you know, Thomas Jefferson had a pridefulness about him as well. And this was greatly insulting to his pride as the president. So he decides to not go to Congress, but to, on his own, send a U.S. fighting frigate over to punish this Basha. And it was known as the USS Philadelphia. So the USS Philadelphia, well, it was run aground. It was a trap. It started chasing after two smaller boats, and they ran them ashore so that they couldn't get back out into the water. And so they came aboard and they took the soldiers. Now these are U.S. soldiers, right? And they instead of sending them to Istanbul, the Basha kept them as his personal servants. Okay. And just I have a sick sense of humor, but I just found it kind of strange that because there were quite a few of them. One of them took the deal and became Muslim for his freedom, and he put him in charge over his old American compadres, his Navy cadets, and he was cruel and harsh to them and became like a sycophant, right? As someone who sucks up to the leader, a sycophant to the Basha. And I don't think he ever came back, because I think there would have been a push to have him heavily punished. But the rest of them, right, were kept as prisoners. And so Thomas Jefferson at this point still doesn't want word to get out, not even to Congress. And so he sends a guy named William Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, to the Barbary Coast with money that he had taken from the federal executive branch and from his own money to raise a mercenary army over in Egypt and to get the brother to be brought back on the throne of Yusuf's. And then, of course, that brother would promise us that he would not engage in piracy in the future against us. Well, not much came of that, to be honest. They didn't gather enough men. What little fighting they didn't do too well. And Yusuf, by the end of this war, is still the Basha of Tripoli. So the William Eaton expedition kind of failed. But finally, at this time, Congress finds out, and they're furious with the president because he's been keeping this from all of them. And just think about that. Like in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was writing his long list of grievances against George III of England, right? And he says, and one example of his autocratic rule, right, as his one-man tyranny, is he grabs boys and he sends them overseas to fight in these foreign lands and to die without any permission of the elected reps to give their permission for the boys to go fight. And now here he is doing the same thing, sending these Americans over there without congressional knowledge, much less approval, right? So you see how in so many ways he contradicted himself when he became president. And so at any rate, they sent an expedition over that did pretty well. Stephen Decatur, Decatur, became a hero in the press in fighting against the forces really well. And we extracted the all of the American soldiers except for the one that turned against us. But we also, however, paid a fee to the Basha. So it was not an overwhelming victory by any means. But it was called the Tripolitan War or the Barbary Coast War. And it was largely unofficial. And Thomas Jefferson was responsible for it. All right. So another way in which he kind of contradicted himself as president. And then, of course, one of the main ways that he did was with slaves. He did not even he didn't even free his slaves at death. He gave them over to his white daughter. But he wrote in the state notes on the state of Virginia, right? He said, slaves are made by very nature to be sycophants, right? Sycophants. A sycophant, right, is someone who is the opposite of a meritocracy, right? Of being able to earn and work your way up to a position, is you are at the mercy of your boss. And you must simply play the games. You must flatter and kiss up to the boss. You must sometimes be deceitful and hide things from the boss, etc. Right? And he said that with that nature of slavery itself, and making sycophants of the slaves, you can never truly count on the friendship of a slave because they have no choice. And he says, how much more can you not depend upon the amorous love of a slave woman who was at your mercy as a master? And so he wrote all this, right? And then he ends up becoming lovers with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, and they had 4 children together. And so at any rate, you know, he's just contradicting his rhetoric time and time again. But at any rate, their oldest son was Beverly, and he promised Beverly was supposedly headstrong. And I guess when he would tell Beverly of his affections for him, Beverly would say, then prove it, Dad. Prove it by letting me have my freedom. And he said, I will at your 18th birthday. And so at any rate, just about the time of his 18th birthday, word came out in the press about his affair with Sally Hemings. He had gone to France 2 or 3 times, and they were open there because they were more progressive over there in France, and he could be more open about being lovers with her. But of course, he couldn't do that. He wasn't willing to do that here in Virginia. And so at any rate, he tells the son, Beverly, I'm sorry, we have to lay low for a while because of the bad press. And he goes, you're going to have to wait longer than expected for me to free you. And Beverly ran away. And we don't know of him ever contacting Thomas Jefferson again. And then you have a case in which she is in Paris with him, and she refuses the final time to get back, to go back, and says, why should I leave? I have everything here that I want. They treat me well here in France. And she goes, I'm not coming back with you unless you promise me something. And he promised her that he would free their kids for her return to Virginia. So at any rate, he came back, and he did. He freed them, but he never continued to have a relationship with them. The youngest one, they said he had the closest relationship with, the youngest boy. His name was Eston. And Eston, they said, was a lot like him. His mannerisms, even his looks, but obviously darker skin. And his fondness of books and music, etc. And they said that they wept when they embraced each other the last time as he let Eston go. But at any rate, right, he wouldn't take a stand. He wouldn't take a stand to free his slaves. He wouldn't take a stand with his relationship with Sally Hemings. Yeah, so at any rate, going back to the thesis, is Alan Brinkley in the textbook says that Thomas Jefferson did not have too much of a spine. He was very non-confrontational. And so he kept running into forces that he felt were overwhelming, that were larger than himself, right? And in each time when he was confronted with those large forces, he caved in. He caved in and said, you know what? Instead of being idealistic like I used to be, of not seeing the world as it is, but seeing it as it ought to be and wanting to improve it, right? Is he became pragmatic, just simply doing the practical thing, whatever yielded the immediate best practical results. That's what he did. All right. But what a fascinating figure, huh? Thomas Jefferson. And he had a daughter who went through some bad experiences with an abusive husband from because his wife had died. But his daughter with the late wife, she got with an abusive husband, and he encouraged her to run away from him, to separate from him. And when she came with her daughter, and she found out, she put it together with Sally Hemings and Sally Hemings' daughter, she was mad with jealous rage, and that she was very cruel, both to Sally Hemings and even to her daughter, as like a competition for Thomas Jefferson's affection and attention. And Thomas Jefferson did nothing to defend Sally and her daughter. All right. Number 5, I'll try to speed this up. Okay. Fogel and Ingerman, they wrote a book called Time on the Cross, and they stated in it that slaves were not treated that badly because they were expensive investments. All right. So that because they had paid so much for these slaves, they wanted the best utility from them. So therefore, it was in their best interest not to physically harm them. It was in their best interest to feed them well and to tend to them when they were injured or sick. All right, well, I clearly say in this one that I don't think that flies. All right. The first thing I look at is slave discontent, evidence of slave discontent. There's just too much of it. Absconding, running away, downright rebelling, working slow on purpose, meeting secretly at night when they were told explicitly not to, and many other ways in sneaking extra food and doing many of those other things that I thought were demonstrative of the fact that they clearly were not happy. Those clearly were signs of discontent of the slaves. Then you also have evidence, more direct evidence. The madams, their diaries, the white wife of the master. We have a lot of evidence from them of physical and psychological torment. And of course, right, as you see in the movies that they pick up pretty well, is especially the house slaves. So much in life is bittersweet, right? When you're out on the plantation, you're more likely to work your bottom off, right? Than you were if you were inside the home. But when you're inside the home, despite the physical, more amenable environment to your comfort, is you were under constant scrutiny, under the constant eye of the slave, of the slave's daughter, of the slave's son, or the master's, of the master's wife, etc. A lot of the manumitted slaves, when they look at the lists of the slaves that received manumission, that were either freed or paid for their freedom, most of them, according to the sources I've read, were women with biracial children. So you could kind of do the math where they probably made ultimatums or they made deals with their masters, etc. And so all that a slave had to worry about. Also, when they excavated bones at some of the slave quarters in the South, they found evidence on the hip bone and the shoulder bone of the grown men. And of course, they know the difference between an external source, right, of an abrasion or a break or something like that, and an internal one. And in this case, it was internal, is that they have evidence of the hip bones and the shoulder bones of them having worked with heavy weight for extended periods of time, so that it literally was molding down their hips and shoulders. Okay, so we have evidence of that. You also have evidence of the babies and the toddlers. A lot of them prematurely had their skull synthesized together. You know, the babies have the soft spot, and there's a time period for which it to close the cranium, and they were prematurely closed in many cases. And it's not the only possibility, but one major possibility is malnutrition, is the body does something to compensate for malnutrition, and the skull prematurely synthesizes in babies that are being starved, basically. You have that.
What would that do to them?
I'm sorry?
What would that do to the babies when that happened?
Well, I mean, hopefully, I hope it doesn't mean that any of them died of starvation. It just whatever happened to them in their death, you know, they would contend that it was a sickness of some sort, but that synthesized skull prematurely is evidence, they think, of them being very malnourished, so that that it could have been avoided.
Sure.
They could have been better taken care of.
Right.
All right, and then later on we have slaves narratives all the way up to the 1930s with the last generation of slaves as elderly people talking about their experiences, and we have plenty of evidence of there being constant friction, tension, slaves never being able to truly say what they really mean, and always on the lookout for themselves, for self-preservation, to try to stay out of trouble, but yet try. And again, there's so much evidence of them sneaking to get food alone that to me that suggests that they were not all adequately fed.
Hmm.
All right, and then yeah, take a look at these, okay? And then the last one, the alleged utility of religious instruction of slaves. And I'm kind of all over the place on this last one, you guys, because I'm just trying to say that it was a little bit of everything. Okay? That it was a little bit of everything. So, first of all, right, the two major camps that they put it in is one is that religion, right, to an oppressed people is the opiate, right? It's the Vicodin pill that they swallow, and it just gives them a nice euphoric feeling, and it pacifies them. It takes the claws out of their paws. It keeps them waiting for a heaven and hell on the other side of this world, and so that therefore they're willing to endure almost anything here on earth. So in that case, right, that would be very useful for masters, right? And some said that, and some wrote of that and said that tried to push other slave masters to do the same and implore them that religion has a salutary, a soothing effect on the slaves. Okay. Now, in here, I do find and show evidence of that sometimes being the case, right? Of them loving their masters, of them being very genuinely happy during religious worship, at least, and showing love to their masters, to their overseers, etc. And being able to just cope and not revolt, right? However, what I also mentioned in here is that did not happen with all of them, because there is some revolutionary potential in Christianity. And I get into Christianity itself and how, yes, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And he contended that he was not here to overthrow the Romans from the Jews, right? But at the same time, there are other verses, other books, like when you look at the book of Exodus about the Jews leaving Egypt, right? And God himself fighting against the Pharaoh of Egypt to free them. The you had places, you guys, where they would the masters would tell them, you literally have to take the book of Exodus out of your Bible. I don't want them hearing about it. I don't want them able to read it, etc. I kid you not. And you have verses, right, where it states that this Christian God plays no favorites, and that all are equally, indebted to him, regardless of color, etc. Here. So at any rate, what I'm saying is to some slaves, there's evidence that Christianity empowered them. They're like, wait a minute, this God says he's the God of my master and of me. He says to him that there's no such thing as color, there's no difference of Jew or Gentile, Greek or barbarian, etc., that all are in Christ. And that gave them empowerment. It gave them self-esteem. And it also gave them a psychological edge, because I kid you not, there are a lot of sources that I've come across that have stated of masters begging the forgiveness of their slaves on their deathbeds because they felt like they were going to hell, and they wanted God to forgive them for how they had treated their slaves, and that it having kind of an empowering effect on the slaves.
Mhm.
All right. But then you, of course, you have your more extreme situations like Gabriel Prosser's rebellion and other rebellions in which they claim to have been, John Brown, we'll get to later, where they claim to have been, influenced by their Christianity to rise up and to kill their masters. So I said it's a little bit of everything. So cases of slaves finding comfort for their pain, a sense of dignity and worth to combat their shame, a place to cathartically, right, like get your steam out, vent their frustrations, and a place to acquire hope while in a state of despair, remind us that there was not a single monolithic result from slaves' reception to the Christian gospel. Some seem to have genuinely, lovingly surrendered all injustices to God and loved, quote, those who persecuted them. Others needed Christianity just to cope. Some channeled their anger into expectation of eventual justice, while others received ample God esteem to expect divine sanction of their rebellion. All right, so I'm going to note, you guys, I'm going to put down that I'm going to give you 10 points today.
Thank you.
You guys have earned it. Yeah, we're getting close to 2 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. So absolutely, I'm happy to do that.
Teacher, have you read Robinson's Crusoe?
You know what? I haven't, sadly.
Oh, okay. But in that book, I've read it. But in that book, there's no chapters. That book is just one continuous chapter.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. But in the beginning part, it talks about how Robinson is sailing in his ship from England for the first time from England towards the coast of Africa, North Africa, and
Sure.
he's intercepted by what we talked about here. I don't know if it was in chapter 5 or whatever, when Jefferson sent his ships, and one of them ran ashore,
Sure.
and there were pirates that captured them, chased his ship, boarded it, captured him. In that book, if you were to read it, that reminded me of that because it was pirates from North Africa, from Morocco, whatever that was chasing him. They caught up to him, they captured him, they took him back to Morocco, whatever, North Africa, made him a slave, a prisoner, had him convert, and it just, I remembered that from that book as we were talking about that particular thing that Jefferson did when he sent ships over there to deal with that. That just reminded me.
Wow.
It's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah. No,
happened.
I've heard of that book several times, and I've intended to read it, but I
You
haven't.
should. It's a
Yeah.
great adventure. It's fun to read. It's one of my favorites.
Good.
But
Good. That's great.
anyway, I just mentioned that because that reminded me of that what happened in the book in Robinson's Crusoe. The same thing happened, and it was
Sure.
this and that was around the same time, probably 80 or 90 years of difference from when the book was set to what happened with Jefferson.
Sure.
Mhm. Anyways, I just thought I'd mention that.
No, I'm glad you did. I am really. That's a fascinating topic. It really is.
Yeah, that's a lot to learn.
There's always so much to learn.
Mhm.
But so do you guys feel pretty good about the night? You feel
Oh.
pretty good about all 6 of them?
Yes, I do
Okay.
at least.
All right. All right. Thank you so much for sticking it through with me. Like I said, I promise you, I'm going to give you 10 points for this one. You guys have earned every one of them.
Thank you, teacher.
All right. Thank you. Well, you guys have a good night. Okay.
Thank you. Had a wonderful evening.
You
Have a
as
good
well,
evening.
Jacob. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Bye, you guys.
Bye-bye.